ability. The frigate was the most versatile warship in the age of sail. Through the 18th and early 19th centuries, frigates prowled the seas, acting as the eyes of the fleet for the navies they served. They were equally important as a source of both intimidation and protection for the merchant ships that were the lifeblood of maritime trade. And when engaged in battle, frigates could be devastating. Among the most powerful sailing frigates ever constructed were those designed by American Joshua Humphreys in the late 18th century. A classic of this type was the 44-gun USS Constitution. 204 feet long, 43.5 feet wide, and displacing nearly 1,600 tons. She was significantly larger than frigates in other navies. Yet with her fine lines and over 42,000 square feet of sail, the Constitution could turn deftly on the ocean waves and reach speeds of up to 14 knots. The courageous men who served on these vessels were as important as the ships themselves, winning fame and their country's glory while providing some of the most stirring moments in naval history. Roaming like lone wolves over the oceans, frigates became one of the most widely used warships of all time. Swift, well-armed and self-sufficient, they were ideally suited for independent action. They could remain at sea for up to 6 months at a time, sailing vast distances in relatively short periods. All of these assets helped make the frigate an invaluable scouting ship in the world's navies, earning it the nickname, the eyes of the fleet.
Every fleet needs its eyes. It needs its scouts, especially in those days. No radar, no telephone. So how is an admiral to know where his enemy is? Now, he doesn't want to split his fleet up. He needs them together in the fleet. But he needs things light and fast to go out and search all round ahead of the fleet. So he wants light, fast scouts. And that is your frigate.
Frigates were just as valuable when serving as support vessels for the massive ships of the line that were the core of a sailing navy's striking power. They performed numerous other missions as well, from escorting friendly merchant ships in hostile waters to attacking enemy vessels in times of war. Yet despite its wide usage, the origins of the frigate are somewhat mysterious. Even the source of its name is cloaked in obscurity. Many experts believe that the Spanish were the first to coin the term fragata in the 16th century.
The Spaniards really brought it into use for the ships which they used to supply their colonies in America. It's a sort of a convenient word which gets attached to ships of a basically speedy, light construction used in various purposes.
These early ancestors of the frigate mounted oars in addition to sails to ensure their mobility, even if there was no wind. By the mid-16th century, warships very similar in structure were being built in England. In 1586, a famous English shipwright named Matthew Baker made a revolutionary drawing that illustrated the distinctive features of these swift and maneuverable vessels, which were also the basis for the legendary race-built galleons that helped defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588.
What Matthew Baker has done is to think of the analogy between the most efficient hull shape and the most efficient shape that he knew in nature. So the point in a way is theological, and that is the shape of a mackerel. This really is what people would have called a frigate. And the remarkable thing about her is just how little of her there is above the waterline. And she's essentially got one major row of guns. She's also got row ports there, there, there. So you can see the transition. So she has guns on the main deck, and then she has row ports so she can still be propelled by oars above them.
By the early 17th century, Northern European sea raiders were employing a sleeker and swifter version of this craft for attacking their adversaries' merchant ships in the North Atlantic. The British Royal Navy had yet to evolve into the great force it would become, And during the English Civil War of 1642-48, British ships were a frequent target of these marauding predators.
They were long, narrow, lightly armed, highly maneuverable, and fast vessels. Because they caused so much difficulty during the Civil War, when the war ended, the Admiralty began ordering large numbers of these frigates to be built to serve in the British Navy.
Constructed under the central authority of the British Admiralty, which was the British Navy's high command, these early English frigates could be up to 100 feet long. Like earlier frigates, they usually had 3 masts and mounted their guns on a single deck. But their designers had begun to reconsider the idea of using both sails and oars to propel the ship.
The next development is a radical simplification. It's getting rid of oars, realizing that oars are not a practical thing, partly because of the number of men required to actually operate the huge sweeps that were necessary to pull along a 100-foot vessel.
By the beginning of the 18th century, most of the frigates employed by the British, Spanish, and French had grown to include 2 covered gun decks mounting anywhere from 24 to 50 guns. But by the middle of the century, the design evolved once again, when the second covered gun deck was removed because it made the ships too clumsy.
At that point, it was realized that a ship with 1 row of guns could be made relatively long, carry a significant amount of firepower, and still be maneuverable. This allowed a very powerful armament to be carried on a very nimble ship.
Standardized by the French, it was this model with a single covered gun deck and a crew of between 250 and 300 men that became the classic frigate of the age.
It was really the French who came up with the idea of what we call the true frigate in the 1740s, and the British copied that because they found that, suddenly the enemy, the principal enemy, was using these very speedy, maneuverable, independent ships, which, although they only had guns on a single deck, were extremely effective.
Though similar, there were significant differences between English and French frigates, differences that were dictated by the contrasting battle tactics of the 2 rival nations, who were frequently at war during the 18th century. The English preferred more durable and heavily armed ships that were best suited to fight at close range. The French, on the other hand, emphasized speed and agility, designing their frigates to wage battles of maneuver. However, as with all frigates at the time, both British and French frigates were rated by their firepower. A 38-gun, 18-pounder frigate like the British Guerrière meant that the ship carried 38 guns that fired 18-pound cannonballs as her main armament.
They were continually trying to find the right weight of armament, and this is why you get this whole range of ships. You get, the 32-gun frigate armed with 12-pounder guns. You get the 32-gun frigate armed with 18-pounder guns. Then you go up to a 36-gun frigate, and then you go and it's absolutely wonderful for the ship buffs, because they are simply debating the merits of these things to this day.
Despite these classifications, however, it was not unusual for a frigate to be outfitted with more guns than she was designed for, in an effort to maximize her fighting power. As the armament of a frigate increased, so did its size. Some frigates in the late 18th century reached 150 feet in length, making them nearly as long as the primary battleship of the period, the mighty ship of the line. But although they were powerful raiding and scouting vessels, frigates were never intended to fight alongside the more massive ships of the line in the main battle fleet. Built to carry as many guns as possible, the largest ships of the line mounted over 100 cannon, 3 times as many as a standard frigate, and at a displacement of 3,500 tons, outweighed the smaller ships by a margin of up to 4 to 1. Nevertheless, frigates did perform valuable service during clashes between main battle fleets. When the opposing ships of the line arrayed themselves in the single-file rows that were the standard battle formations of the age, frigates took their place on the perimeter, out of the line of fire. From there, they used their speed to dart in among the thunderous barrages, rescuing sailors from sinking vessels or towing damaged ships of the line out of harm's way. But perhaps their most important responsibility was to relay flag messages from the fleet commander to the other ships in the battle line, who disincentive for the sailors aboard all warships. But because frigates often operated against merchant ships carrying valuable cargo, the opportunities to win prize money aboard.
As brigs or sloops simply would not do the job. They would be too small for the exercise of power in the Mediterranean. On the other hand, we could not build ships of the line Ships of the line are enormously expensive to construct, and they consume tremendous manpower.
Although they were less expensive than ships of the line, the new frigates were still the largest defense expenditure yet for the U.S. government. Congress allocated the then enormous sum of almost $700,000 for the work. With so much at stake, someone with skill and experience was needed to oversee the task. That man was Philadelphia ship designer Joshua Humphreys.
Humphreys was chosen because he was a well-known Philadelphia shipbuilder, had a very high reputation, had been building vessels in Philadelphia for many, many years.
Humphreys' goal was to design frigates that combined the strength and durability of British warships with the swiftness and agility favored by the French. In addition, he intended their main armament to be 44 guns, 30 of which fired 24-pound cannonballs, significantly more firepower than carried by standard European frigates. But the extra armament would create extra weight, which could not only weaken the ship's structure, but potentially make it slower and clumsier as well.
When you had a ship of war and you had these one or more gun decks lined with guns, they went as far forward and as far aft as possible, putting huge weights at the extreme ends of the ship, which meant it had a natural tendency to droop at each end.
These downward forces put extraordinary stress on the keel, an enormous piece of timber running lengthwise along the bottom of the ship that served as its structural backbone.
This was called hogging, I suppose because the resultant shape of the keel was sort of like a hog's back. Now, hogging in its severest form would cause the ship to break its back. In lesser terms, it caused maneuvering problems, stability problems. It was a bad thing, pure and simple. Now, what Humphreys did was he put in a series of vertical members between decks to distribute the weight from the gun deck down more evenly to the next deck called the berth deck. And below the berth deck, down in the hold, leading from the underside of the berth deck, were a series of diagonals that then directed this force toward the center of where this bending would occur and had those diagonals meet one another there so they were pressing on each other like isometric exercises. This is one of the diagonal riders I mentioned a moment ago, Joshua Humphreys' unique contribution to naval architecture. There are 3 pairs of these coming down from the bow and 3 other pairs coming forward from the stern. They sweep along the curve of the hull until they finally meet at the keelson. There, the opposing forces cancel one another out and eliminate the problem of hogging. This unique structure was present in all American major sailing warships until the end of the age of fighting sail.
By solving the problem of hogging, Humphreys' brilliant innovations gave his new ships the structural strength to be made larger and more powerful than any frigates afloat, while still having the sleek, stable hulls necessary for great speed and maneuverability. The results were vessels that could outsail and outfight any other frigates in the world.
When the design for the American frigates, what they really put forth was not your ordinary, run-of-the-mill, conventional frigate. These were really super frigates.
In 1797, the first 2 of Joshua Humphreys' new super frigates were launched, the United States in Philadelphia and the USS Constitution in Boston. Yet before this occurred, the U.S. government decided to pay tribute money to the Barbary corsairs in exchange for a guarantee that they would no longer interfere with American trade in the Mediterranean. To some, it appeared that the new ships had been built for nothing. But a different threat soon emerged. In 1798, with France involved in a war with England, French warships began seizing American vessels.
France had been our ally in the American Revolution. She had helped us achieve independence. But then when she went to war with Great Britain, she expected us to come to her aid. We did not. We proclaimed neutrality. That proclamation of neutrality was seen by the French as a betrayal. And so the French began to harass our trade.
In the ensuing undeclared or quasi-war with France, America's new frigates quickly proved their worth. In separate engagements, the 38-gun USS Constellation defeated the French frigates L'Insurgente and Vengeance. By the end of the 2-year war, the 45 military vessels employed by the U.S. had captured 95 armed French ships. America's valiant young sailors and her even younger Navy had passed their first test.
There was no trading of territory. There were no great surrenders. Nonetheless, during that war, the American Navy had demonstrated its power to protect American commerce and to keep at sea for long periods of time.
The fledgling U.S. Navy would soon be called upon to prove its capability again. Trouble was once more brewing in the Mediterranean, where the Barbary ruler of Tripoli suddenly demanded additional tribute. With its new navy in place, the leaders of the United States now believed they had the means to contest such extortions. In June of 1801, President Thomas Jefferson dispatched a squadron led by the frigates President, Philadelphia, and Essex to the Mediterranean as a show of force. Yet despite the U.S. presence and a subsequent naval blockade of Tripoli, the corsairs remained defiant, actually increasing their tribute demands. As the undeclared war continued into October of 1803, trouble struck for the U.S. Navy when the Philadelphia, under the command of William Bainbridge, ran aground on an uncharted reef off Tripoli. The enemy swarmed on board and took almost 400 sailors hostage, including Bainbridge himself. In addition to the corsairs' ransom demand of $3 million, the U.S. government had to face the fact that the Tripolitans now possessed a mighty American frigate to reinforce their fleet of smaller vessels. It was not the kind of news that Edward Preble, America's newly appointed Mediterranean squadron commander, wanted to hear.
Here now was a great threat. Something needed to be done. Philadelphia either needed to be rescued or she needed to be destroyed. Preble made the decision that it was not practical to try to rescue her out of the harbor of Tripoli, that the only alternative was to destroy her.
The man who played the key role in this mission was a fearless young lieutenant named Stephen Decatur. When deciding whether to wait for reinforcements or proceed immediately, Decatur brashly declared, "The fewer the number, the greater the glory." On the night of February 16, 1804, Decatur and 75 volunteers stole into Tripoli harbor aboard a small ship, the Intrepid.
She was a vessel that had been captured in the area, and so she looked like a local vessel. Intrepid made her way into the port of Tripoli, came alongside Philadelphia, and Decatur and his men rushed aboard.
The stunned Tripolitan guards either jumped overboard or were cut down in bloody hand-to-hand combat. Within minutes, the Americans had set the Philadelphia ablaze. Decatur and every one of his men escaped safely. When news of his daring raid reached the United States, Stephen Decatur became an instant hero. He was also promoted to captain. At age 25, the youngest man ever to hold that rank in the U.S. Navy. It was an accomplishment that even impressed the most legendary commander in the British Royal Navy.
It was one of the most heroic exploits in the history of the American Navy. It caught the attention not only of Commodore Preble, who promoted Stephen Decatur, but indeed even Admiral Horatio Nelson remarked on what a heroic and magnificent exploit this was by the American Navy.
Despite Decatur's heroism and Preble's relentless bombardment of Tripoli from the Constitution, one fact remained unchanged. The corsairs still held William Bainbridge and all of his men hostage. As the conflict dragged on for another year, it began to appear doubtful whether either side would ever prevail. But finally, the U.S. blockade of Tripoli's ports that had begun in 1801 started to take its toll, and in 1805, the corsairs significantly lowered their ransom demand. Rather than prolong the war further, the U.S. Congress Congress.
Bowsprit, the thing that sticks out in the front, catching in some of Constitution's rigging.
Both sides tried to send boarders to the attack, but the hail of musketry was so intense that neither side was successful.
And
Very fine ships, excellent for the task for which they were designed. They were powerful, powerful ships, and well-ruled, well-sailed. Quite a devastating weapon of war, in fact.
Although the outcome was inconclusive when the War of 1812 ended after 3 years, one thing was certain. The fledgling American Navy had proved itself a force to be reckoned with on a global scale.
the United States ended the War of 1812 in a state of euphoria. It's not that we didn't lose naval battles or duels, but we did. But all this was forgotten. All that was remembered was what we had done to John Bull. The U.S. morale just soared. It brought together many divisive factions in the nation and really guaranteed the continued existence of the United States Navy.
It was a Navy anchored by its core of awe-inspiring frigates that was ready to expand once again to meet any challenge on the high seas. Thanks largely to the sterling performance of the Yankee frigates in the War of 1812, the U.S. government became convinced that if it were to maintain the respect America had earned as a world power, it should strengthen its Navy.
The celebrated victories of the American frigates in the War of 1812 had a tremendous effect upon the reputation of the American Navy. They gave the image of power and strength and determination, that America was a nation here that intended to stay.
In 1815, the heavy frigates Guerrière and Java, named after two of the British frigates defeated in the war, joined the U.S. fleet, as well as 3 74-gun ships of the line. A year later, Congress gave its approval for 9 more 74s and 12 44-gun frigates. But before construction began on the new ships, America had to deal once again with the Barbary corsairs. At the start of the War of 1812, the Barbary ruler of Algiers, Hassan Pasha, had allied himself with the British and resumed seizing American ships. During the war, the hard-pressed U.S. Navy could do nothing about these attacks. Soon as the war was over, however, President Madison dispatched Stephen Decatur and 2 squadrons of U.S. ships to the Mediterranean. Decatur, aboard the 44-gun Guerriere, promptly imposed America's terms not only on Algiers, but on Tripoli and Tunis, who had also taken American ships. The deals were proposed, as Decatur put it, at the mouth of our cannon, and quickly accepted. Never again would American ships pay a penny of tribute to the Barbary corsairs.
Decatur showed the flag, showed the force, showed the open gun ports of the American frigates, and that did the job. Simply the presence of that squadron and the size and strength of it persuades the Tripolitans that peace is more beneficial to them than war.
In an effort to ensure that the corsairs would keep their word, Decatur urged that a respectable force be left behind in the region. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. Navy formed a Mediterranean squadron anchored by 2 frigates. It was the precedent for America maintaining a naval presence abroad.
The American frigates, they certainly gave the American Republic a presence, visibility in far distant places. Their capacity to be able to sustain themselves independently and still be a significant force was vital in the record of their success.
The Yankee frigates had shown their mettle in war, peace, and armed diplomacy, helping to unite a young nation divided by regional interests and differing points of view.
The victories of those ships, the heroic actions of those captains and seamen, gave Americans something to rally behind. It gave a unity and a spirit to the Republic that might otherwise have been lacking, and we might well have been doomed to failure had we not been united as a people in celebrating the victories of these American frigates.
Despite their valiant service, life after battle was unkind to most of these remarkable ships. After their active careers ended in the early 19th century, many of the original Yankee frigates were either scrapped or burned. As for the grandest frigate of them all, the USS Constitution, time and inactivity threatened to become more formidable than any enemy ship she had ever faced.
In about 1830, the Secretary of the